Sidney Cam was now in his mid-60s and resentful of the lack of government support. With no prospect of new fighters, the future of Hawker aircraft once again looked bleak. But in a strategic rethink at Kingston, Cam's habit of always looking to the future was to pay dividends. It was argued that the Army would continue to need close support and reconnaissance from manned aircraft, combining the characteristics of a helicopter with those of a strike-attack fighter, and that such aircraft would need to operate close to the battle area rather than from large airfields vulnerable to attack by enemy bombers. A French engineer called Michel Villebois had recently proposed the concept of vertical takeoff and landing. Stanley Hooker of Bristol Siddeley Engines had taken his proposals, and his project engineer Gordon Lewis turned it into a practical engine design. Although suspicious of the concept, Cam made a practice of encouraging his project team to develop new ideas and gave Lewis's engine brochure to his project engineer Ralph Hooper. Hooper conceived of the aircraft layout which would later lead to the Harrier jump jet. Over a number of years, Bristol, with inputs from Hawker Aircraft, developed the revolutionary Pegasus engine, a single engine fitted with 4 jet nozzles whose thrust could be directed downward for takeoff to forward for conventional flight. The Pegasus engine made possible what became known as vectored thrust. The idea was brilliant and proved to be one of the great breakthroughs in aeronautical design. Ralph Hooper completed the work developing an airframe, and the project was designated the P1127. Stanley Hooker was astonished one day to receive a call from Cam to say he had the outline plans of an aircraft. There was little interest, however, from the government, who remained sceptical about the whole enterprise. As such, the initial development of the P1127 was financed as a private venture using company money. There was, however, interest from the US Air Force, who provided funding to Bristol Siddeley for engine development. Finally, in late 1959, government support was received with a contract for 2 prototypes. The first tethered hover was achieved at Dunsfold, the aircraft being tethered on the insistence of the Ministry of Supply, who now owned it. The pilot, Bill Bedford, remarked that the process was akin to that of learning to ride a bicycle down a narrow corridor in the dark. 5 months later, the first free hover took place, and by September 1961 the prototype was able to lift off vertically, transition into forward flight, and back to a vertical landing. The concept had been proved, and practical, vertical, and short takeoff and landing, VSTOL, had become a reality. The prototype P1127s continued performing well, and British and American test pilots were impressed with the simplicity of the concept and its performance, both in the free hover and in conventional flight. More prototypes were built, and more thrust added to the Pegasus engine. In 1963, the first vertical carrier landing took place on HMS Ark Royal. Despite some mishaps, the aircraft began to attract international interest. In this climate, Britain, the USA, and West Germany combined to support the formation of a tripartite evaluation squadron to assess the value of VSTOL under more realistic service conditions. This involved some redesign of the P1127, which was renamed the Kestrel. In 1961, NATO issued a requirement for a supersonic vertical short takeoff and landing aircraft, and, with their experience in the field, Hawker Aircraft entered the competition. Their resulting design, the P1154, in effect a supersonic Harrier, was declared the technical winner in a competition marred by political infighting. John Fozzard led the Hawker design team on the P1154. Like Ralph Hooper, he was a graduate of Robert Lickley's at Cranfield, and both had joined CAM's design team in the 1950s. NATO had no procurement budget of its own, relying on member countries for finance. The P1154's victory was not acceptable to the French, and thus the NATO project fizzled out. There was, however, interest from the British government for a common version to satisfy both the RAF and the Royal Navy. But the two services had widely differing requirements, and between 1962 and 64, Hawker Aircraft proposed many versions to satisfy both operators whilst achieving the commonality and lower costs insisted on by the Treasury. Eventually, the Royal Navy pulled out in favour of the American F-4 Phantom fighter, and the P1154 was designed to an RAF specification. In 1964, the Labour government of Harold Wilson came to power committed to making difficult decisions on defence spending and British involvement east of Suez. Slimming down the aircraft industry formed part of its agenda to modernise Britain. The project on which the future of the RAF was based was the TSR-2, a replacement for the Canberra jet bomber, the operational requirement for which had somehow survived Duncan Sand's axe in 1957. Originally designed by English Electric at Wharton, after industry mergers it fell into the orbit of Sir George Edwards British Aircraft Corporation. The demanding specification was for an all-purpose aircraft that could go supersonic at high and low altitude, could carry a large payload of nuclear weapons, and had a long range but with the ability to work from short airstrips. The TSR-2 was developed against a background of government wrangling, inter-service rivalry and industrial confusion. Yet miraculously, a prototype was built which after successful flight testing shaped up as an exceptional aircraft, an advance on any similar European aircraft of the day. But within governments there existed a powerful lobby against the TSR-2 and in favour of the American F-111. It argued that Britain could no longer afford to compete with America in the production of military aircraft, that the TSR-2 was a bottomless pit of expenditure, and that an off-the-shelf solution would be cheaper. In April 1965, Defence Secretary Denis Healey announced that the TSR-2 was to be cancelled with immediate effect, writing off £195 million of development costs, and the F-111 was to be ordered for the RAF. The aircraft industry heard the decision with disbelief, prompting the remark from Sidney Cam, "All modern aircraft have 4 dimensions: span, length, height, and politics. The TSR-2 simply got the first 3 right." The TSR-2 was not the only project to be axed. With it also went the P1154, another £21 million of development costs, and Hawker Aircraft's hopes of building a supersonic aircraft. This round of cuts ended the prospect that Britain could remain in the major league of aircraft manufacturing countries. There was demoralisation in the industry, and redundancies followed. Demoralisation turned to anger when it became clear that technical problems suffered by the F-111s ordered by the Australian Air Force made it more expensive than the TSR-2. The policy of cancel British, buy American could not, after all, be justified on grounds of cost, and the whole unhappy TSR-2 story remains one of the great what-ifs of British aviation. In January 1968, in a further round of cuts after the devaluation of the pound, the F-111 contract was cancelled, writing off a further £46 million, leaving the RAF with no long-range strike capability and tensions in Anglo-US relations. US Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "The British do not have the backup or hardware to deal with any big world problem. They are no longer a powerful ally of ours because they cannot afford the cost of an adequate defence effort." American F-4 Phantoms were bought for the Royal Navy in place of the P-1154. They were delivered only slightly earlier, cost almost as much, and had no VSTOL capability, making them operationally less flexible. The cancellation of the P-1154 was a huge blow to Hawker aircraft, but there was to be a silver lining. During the early 1960s, the P-1127 development was kept deliberately low-key to avoid upsetting the unstable political situation around the P-1154. Meanwhile, the trials of the Kestrel in the tripartite squadron had been an unqualified success, and the Americans were impressed with the aircraft's potential. 6 Kestrels subsequently went back to the USA, where they were trialled by the US Army, Navy, and Air Force. The success of the Kestrel trials and the cancellation of defence projects in 1965 persuaded the Ministry of Defence to order a redesigned, advanced version for service with the RAF.